The Talking Fish. Part 1, Chinese Folk Tale. Long, long before your great-grandfather was born there lived in the village of everlasting happiness two men called Li and Sing. Now, these two men were close friends, living together in the same house. Before settling down in the village of everlasting happiness they had ruled as high officials for more than 20 years. They had often treated the people very harshly, so that everybody, old and young, disliked and hated them, and yet, by robbing the wealthy merchants and by cheating the poor, these two evil companions had become rich, and it was in order to spend their ill-gotten gains in idle amusements that they sought out the village of everlasting happiness. For here, said they, we can surely find that joy which has been denied us in every other place. Here we shall no longer be scorned by men and reviled by women. Consequently these two men bought for themselves the finest house in the village, furnished it in the most elegant manner, and decorated the walls with scrolls filled with wise sayings and pictures by famous artists. Outside there were lovely gardens filled with flowers and birds, and oh, ever so many trees with queer twisted branches growing in the shape of tigers and other wild animals. Whenever they felt lonely Li and Sing invited rich people of the neighborhood to come and dine with them, and after they had eaten, sometimes they would go out upon the little lake in the center of their estate, rowing in an awkward flat-bottomed boat that had been built by the village carpenter. One day, on such an occasion, when the sun had been beating down fiercely upon the clean-shaven heads of all those on the little barge, for you must know this was long before the day when hats were worn at least, in the village of everlasting happiness Mr. Li was suddenly seized with a giddy feeling, which rapidly grew worse and worse until he was in a burning fever. Snake's blood mixed with powdered deer horn is the thing for him, said the wise-looking doctor who was called in, peering at Li carefully through his huge glasses. Be sure, he continued, addressing Li's personal attendant, and, at the same time, snapping his long fingernails nervously, be sure, above all, not to leave him alone, for he is in danger of going raving mad at any moment, and I cannot say what he may do if he is not looked after carefully. A man in his condition has no more sense than a baby. Now, although these words of the doctor's really made Mr. Li angry, he was too ill to reply, for all this time his head had been growing hotter and hotter, until at last a feverish sleep overtook him. No sooner had he closed his eyes than his faithful servant, half famished, rushed out of the room to join his fellows at their midday meal. Li awoke with a start. He had slept only 10 minutes. Water, water, he moaned, bathe my head with cold water, I am half dead with pain. But there was no reply, for the attendant was dining happily with his fellows. Air, air, groaned Mr. Li, tugging at the collar of his silk shirt, I'm dying for water, I'm starving for air, this blazing heat will kill me, it is hotter than the fire God himself ever dreamed of making it. Wang, wang. Clapping his hands feebly and calling to his servant, air and water, air and water. But still no wang. At last, with the strength that is said to come from despair, Mr. Li arose from his couch and staggered toward the doorway. Out he went into the paved courtyard, and then, after only a moment's hesitation, made his way across it into a narrow passage that led into the lake garden. What do they care for a man when he is sick? He muttered. My good friend Sing is doubtless even now enjoying his afternoon nap, with a servant standing by to fan him, and a block of ice near his head to cool the air. What does he care if I die of a raging fever? Doubtless he expects to inherit all my money, and my servants. That rascal Wang has been with me these 10 years, living on me and growing lazier every season. What does he care if I pass away? Doubtless he is certain that Sing's servants will think of something for him to do, and he will have even less work than he has now. Water, water, I shall die if I don't soon find a place to soak myself. So saying, he arrived at the bank of a little brook that flowed in through a water gate at one side of the garden and emptied itself into the big fish pond. Flinging himself down by a little stream Li bathed his hands and wrists in the cool water. How delightful! If only it were deep enough to cover his whole body, how gladly would he cast himself in and enjoy the bliss of its refreshing embrace. For a long time he lay on the ground, rejoicing at his escape from the doctor's clutches. Then, as the fever began to rise again, he sprang up with a determined cry, what am I waiting for? I will do it, there's no one to prevent me, and it will do me a world of good. I will cast myself head first into the fish pond. It is not deep enough near the shore to drown me if I should be too weak to swim, and I am sure it will restore me to strength and health." He hastened along the little stream, almost running in his eagerness to reach the deeper water of the pond. He was like some small Tom Brown who had escaped from the watchful eye of the master and run out to play in a forbidden spot. Hark! Was that a servant calling? Had Wang discovered the absence of his employer? Would he sound the alarm, and would the whole place soon be alive with men searching for the fever-stricken patient? With one last sigh of satisfaction Li flung himself, clothes and all, into the quiet waters of the fishpond. Now Li had been brought up in Fujian province on the seashore, and was a skillful swimmer. He dived and splashed to his heart's content, then floated on the surface. "It takes me back to my boyhood," he cried. "Why, oh why, is it not the fashion to swim? I'd love to live in the water all the time, and yet some of my countrymen are even more afraid than a cat of getting their feet wet. As for me, I'd give anything to stay here forever." "You would, eh, eh?" chuckled a hoarse voice just under him, and then there was a sort of wheezing sound, followed by a loud burst of laughter. Mr. Li jumped as if an arrow had struck him, but when he noticed the fat, ugly monster below, his fear turned into anger. "Look here, what do you mean by giving a fellow such a start? Don't you know what the classics say about such rudeness?" The giant fish laughed all the louder. "What time do you suppose I have for classics? You make me laugh till I cry." "But you must answer my question," cried Mr. Li, more and more persistently, forgetting for the moment that he was not trying some poor culprit for a petty crime. "Why do you laugh? Speak out at once, fellow." "Well, since you are such a saucy piece," roared the other, "I will tell you, it was because you awkward creatures, who call yourselves men, the most highly civilized beings in the world, always, 74, think you understand a thing fully when you have only just found out how to do it." "You are talking about the island dwarfs, the Japanese," interrupted Mr. Li. "We Chinese seldom undertake to do anything new." "Just hear the man," chuckled the fish. "Now, fancy you're wishing to stay in the water forever. What do you know about water? Why, you're not even provided with the proper equipment for swimming. What would you do if you really lived here always?" "What am I doing now?" spluttered Mr. Li, so angry that he sucked in a mouthful of water before he knew it. "Floundering," retorted the other. "Don't you see me swimming? Are those big eyes of yours made of glass?" "Yes, I see you all right," guffawed the fish, "that's just it, I see you too well. Why, you tumble about as awkwardly as a water buffalo wallowing in a mud puddle." Now, as Mr. Li had always considered himself an expert in water sports, he was, by this time, speechless with rage, and all he could do was to paddle feebly round and round with strokes just strong enough to keep himself from sinking. To be continued.